Now, we will begin with our keynote address. Our first keynote speaker today is Professor Ratna Ghosh. Professor Ratna Ghosh is a distinguished James McGill Professor Emerita at McGill University, where she was the Dean of Education, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. She is also a Fellow of UNESCO TWAS, the World Academy of Sciences, for the advancement of science in developing countries. A member of the Order of Canada, Office of the Orders of Quebec and Montreal, she was featured in the Time magazine, Canadian edition, October 13, 2003, in an article on Canada's Best in Education. Her areas of interest are comparative and international development education, especially education and social justice issues, critical multicultural pedagogy, and recently Tagore's thoughts on inclusive education. She has published extensively and received awards from national and international organizations. She has held important leadership positions, which include President of the Comparative and International Education Society of the US, where she was elected Honorary Fellow, Resident Director, Delhi, and President of the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute and Executive Committee member of the Canadian Human Rights Foundation, now Equitas. She sits on the editorial board of several international journals. Today, ma'am will speak on the topic, including excluded in educational institutions. I request Professor Ratna Ghosh to please begin with the keynote address.
Good morning. I hope it's good morning. It's just after. Professor Ajay Pratap Singh, Director General, National Library of India, Consul General of USA Melinda Pavek, Dean Professor Devatosh Guha, and keynote speaker Professor Norimori Kawai of Hiroshima University, Japan. I want to start by thanking the very dynamic convener of this conference, Professor Santoshi Halder, who very kindly invited me to give the keynote speech here today. I'm deeply honored to be speaking today on a topic which is close to my heart. Inclusion is the foundation or basis of the two most urgent issues of our times: inequality in society and sustainable development for humanity's survival. Let me give you a brief outline, which I will have to really rush through because there is not much time. I will give a brief introduction, the rationale for the inclusion, and maybe I'll just touch on one or 2 points in each of these. But I wanted the headlines because at least it gives you a progression of my thought. The concept of inclusion, what does it mean? Inclusive education. Who are the excluded? Who is excluded in India? It's not the same everywhere. India is very different. The underpinnings for exclusion, which are diversity, difference, and inequality. The importance of teacher education. The development of inclusive education. Is inclusive education a Western concept? Inclusive education in the global North and the global South. By that I mean developed and developing countries, emerging countries. International and national documents on inclusion and inclusive education, and then I'll conclude. So I've told you that there are many important connections between inclusive education and sustainable development, and we need to do that for humanity's survival. In a globalized world, with increasing diversity due to mass migration of people, and the pandemic has underscored the inequality within countries and among them, and also our interconnectedness. But being interconnected implies that inequality affects us all. Inequality means exclusion of people from participation in society. Inclusion is not only fundamental to human dignity, it is also an investment in the upliftment of society and economy and the individual. This awareness has led to a global consensus that everyone should get the opportunity to have an education, to be included. But millions of children globally do not go to school, and research indicates that children, teachers, parents, other stakeholders, all benefit socially and academically when they're included. Currently, inclusion is an often used word in the business world and in education. So the rationale for inclusion. What is the basis for inclusiveness? What does it mean at the most basic level? There are ethical, social, and economic reasons. An attempt to bring individuals to groups together who are marginalized and excluded from the education system leads to the question, why are some excluded? Exclusion is based on the struggle of the politics of difference and identity. Those who are different from the norm become the other. Why are some people excluded, especially from education? Questions like this touch on the intensely political nature of education and the power relations in society, fueled by difference and perpetuated by the educational system, although we think that education is a great equalizer. Inclusion is now quite popular in the business sector, and it benefits the economy. I'm going to go fast on this because it's not that relevant. They think that it strengthens diverse identity ideas with diversity. It leads to innovation. That's the biggest thing. But it also reduces a lot of their costs. The UN Declaration of the Salamanca Statement challenges all countries to make their education systems inclusive as a global standard. It's a controversial term, inclusion, because it means different things to different people. It's often confused with assimilation or integration. It's misused and confused with mainstreaming, and often refers only to special education students and excludes regular students. That's an important thing, because very often when we think of inclusion, we think of the people who are excluded. But inclusion means people who are there already have to be also included. It's a controversial term because it's a politically charged concept which involves power relations. Questions such as who is to be included, even those with severe physical and mental disabilities, should they be included in education? Are there limits to inclusion? Is it a Western concept dumped on other countries and cultures? Can inclusion mean the same thing in all cultures? and all countries despite historical, geopolitical, economic, and socio-cultural differences. What does inclusion mean? Inclusion is not merely the opposite of exclusion. Why? Because we often think of inclusion as inserting people. Just numbers of people, and that is included. But they do not think of the affective domain, which is, are we accepting them? So inclusion has two parts. It's not merely about numbers or inserting people in groups. Including those who have for centuries been excluded means accepting the other in numerical and social terms. There are two important aspects to inclusion. An essential foundation is access to institutions. The quantitative aspect is absolutely necessary because it's a necessary but it's not a sufficient condition. Secondly, it's also an essential to focus on social acceptance. That's the qualitative aspect and most important. Because there's no point in including people whom you are going to be, they're in your classroom, but you're going to ignore them and ostracize them. Inclusion is a way of thinking, it's a worldview. A fundamental condition of dignity is recognition, which is a basic human need and it's central to inclusion. It means acknowledging, accepting and recognizing the other. And the famous political scientist Charles Taylor from my university has written, non-recognition or misrecognition can inflict harm, can be a form of oppression, imprisoning someone in a false, distorted and reduced mode of being. And that is what happens when we include people but do not accept them. It means dismantling patterns of exclusion which create conditions that cause, perpetuate and allow exclusion. The focus on the concept is dignity, which is a human right of the human individual in a universalist and egalitarian way. Inclusion involves psychological, intellectual, and emotional issues. It's a process. It's a process. To work towards an ideal, to be a goal that is to be reached, because it is always in the making. It never stops. Inclusion is always in the making. Ultimately, it leads to social cohesion, peace, sustainable development. Inclusive education is getting all, so that was inclusion. Now we talk about inclusive education. It's getting all students in school, increasing enrollment is a basic. And that's what we have with all the legislations. We have to include them. That means bring them into the classroom. But teaching does not mean that students learn. The 2018 report by Prof in India, which is an NGO, indicates that in India, despite high enrollment, improved physical structures, students are not learning. According to Pratham, a quarter of those finishing grade 8 do not have basic reading skills. Why is that? It's quite often because of social acceptance. Involving students in all aspects of the classroom activities is a must in inclusion. They need to be provided with appropriate access to education for all individuals, respond to the diverse needs of all the students. Inclusion is about breaking barriers in education that exclude, but it also involves reaching out and accepting the other. Not having the body in the classroom, but you have to reach out and accept the other. Making all students feel that they belong. That they belong, they are part of the classroom, of the school, of the society. That's the social inclusion part. At the fundamental level, it is about equity or fairness, or equal opportunity based on individuals' needs. With the collapse of traditional social hierarchies, including historically and traditionally excluded from education, the idea that every learner matters equally, it's very difficult to practice. That every learner matters equally. It is difficult to practice, but it's very difficult for many to accept. Many people cannot accept that. It requires a radical alteration in one's worldview. A dramatic change in social perspective is critical. The shift is from looking at marginalized groups as a problem to seeing their potential. It is the opposite of assimilation, but much more than mere tolerance. It's not the opposite of prejudice because it does not have a moral dimension. It is about respect and aspect of acceptance of difference. What does IE involve? It involves goals of education, neoliberal ideology nowadays that we have, focuses on the commodification of education at the expense of values, care, compassion, cooperation, intercultural understanding, and empathy. Because we focus on word skills, the neoliberal ideology. But IE involves the cognitive as well as the affective and emotional domains in education. The change is in the goals of education to a humanistic education. A dramatic change is necessary in the methods of teaching. It should move from a teacher-centered, that means lecture by the teacher and the students without talking at the other end. It moves from a teacher-centered to a student-centered classroom. And the methods will be dialogical, collaborative, independent methods of learning. That's the pedagogical part. Equal opportunity to learn that will have implications for students, the curriculum, the school, administrators, as well as parents. The policies at the highest level are involved because they involve the goals of education. And well-trained teachers are absolutely crucial. And this needs money. Learning resources have to be different. This needs money. Physical structures that are suitable for all students. Are they suitable for disabled students? Do we have toilets for female students in all schools? A process towards the development of participatory citizenship. IE, or inclusive education, is a sustainable development, a sustainable move towards development of the full potential with dignity through supportive pedagogical approach unique to a child's learning style and identity. How is it different from mainstreaming? Now here I'm going to go fast because mainstreaming implies placing students with special needs in regular classrooms so that they are given the emotional benefits that give them the opportunity for psychosocial development. And this is mainly for disabled children. Integration refers to accommodation. Accommodating students in the school's culture, and both mainstream and integrate means that they should fit into an existing structure. That's the difference. Inclusion is not that. Inclusion implies a shared culture. It's not that somebody is going to be inserted into it. It's a shared culture. IU values children, including students from privileged categories, but implies supporting students who may need help in one or more aspects to reach a level playing field. An inclusive classroom adapts to individual needs. It is dynamic and fluid concept and encourages participation by all students. It focuses on the quality of school experience so that a child who goes there who had been excluded before should not feel that she was not included in the classroom. The school experience should be a happy one, and students' achievements in academic as well as other activities, not only in math and science, but in sports and music and everything. It involves making students feel safe and happy in the space they call school. So who are the excluded? Because we are talking about inclusion, we are talking of including those who are excluded. Who are excluded? The lack of conceptual understanding of the term inclusion has led to its misinterpretation. The concept as a process which is evolving, not an endpoint. It was initially used for special education students to mainstream them, special education students with disabilities, to mainstream them into the regular classrooms. With physical, mental challenges, and because there was a movement towards the rights of children with disabilities, and they had not been recognized, and they were not seemed adequate to put into to regular classrooms. They thought that they would have special schools from them. And then when they had the rights for children, they brought these children in from other schools, from these special schools, and put them into regular schools. But so for a long time, that's what what inclusive education meant, bringing in children with disabilities. But the concept of IE has broadened considerably and now includes all children. The focus now is to include a broad range of out-of-school, vulnerable and marginalized groups globally. That is, if they're not in school, they should be in school. In Global South, as well as in the Global North, where people may be vulnerable for various other reasons, not necessarily because of poverty. So who is to be included? Who are the vulnerable and the marginalized? Inclusion only has meaning when it is juxtaposed with exclusion. We need to look at all groups who are excluded from opportunity to get educated. The ultimate goal is to develop the full potential of every child, every individual, and end all forms of discrimination so that we foster social cohesion. UNESCO data 2022 says that the out-of-school population is 1.2 million in India. But in the world, the 250 million are out of school in the world, globally. And globally, this is largely due to poverty. 48% of those are girls and young women, and 42% of those are boys. Poverty and gender disparity are major causes of exclusion. And the poverty and gender disparity depends on the country's level of economic development, on that society's policies, and the norms of that society. So children with disabilities have been the most marginalized and excluded, and routinely denied their rights, despite the fact that there are so many international conventions to include them. Children, in 2022, UNESCO estimates there were 8 million children with disabilities in India, but 240 million globally. The perceptions about disability are changing from the medical model to the social model, so that it's not a God-given. And how unfortunate you are, which is the medical model. But the social model, that we create barriers. We should be able to create situations, physical structures, to enable people to, that's the social model, to include them in society. Traditionally excluded groups, who are they? Indigenous people. In India we call them scheduled tribes. But all over the world, indigenous people are excluded historically and vulnerable. They're very vulnerable, and this is intergenerational. In countries of the South and settler colonial countries of the North, like US and Canada, including Australia and New Zealand, assimilationist policies in these countries have shown a lack of respect for the dignity of indigenous people and caused loss of identity in youth. Connections with previous generations are lost completely, and indigenous children are stereotyped and bullied and discriminated, and girls especially face violence and abuse. The lack of information on them in the school system, I've experienced that myself. When at the university level they come up and they know nothing about the indigenous people of Canada. Numerous international instruments proclaim universal rights to education, but indigenous people do not fully enjoy these rights. There's a gap between the normal population and indigenous students. But students with special needs have been traditionally excluded, and these are students with disabilities such as physical, intellectual, developmental, and emotional challenges. But lately, there's been a recognition that special needs doesn't only mean disabled children. It also refers to students who have special needs due to differences from mainstream society in their cultural and ethnic background, when they lack the knowledge of instruction, they have special needs. And only recently in immigrant countries, have they been recognized as needing special attention. And refugee children, particularly, have not been given the kind of education and the special needs that they need in school. Special services for refugee students, because in addition to immigrant students, they face trauma, the interrupted schooling, economic insecurities. They all have special needs. Of the estimated 83 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, 42% of them are children. and have to go to school, need education. And as many as 15 to 20% of those are disabled. And refugee children with disabilities have all kinds of disabilities, but the most common is anxiety, 22%, and controlling behavior, which is 10%. So who is excluded in India? Why is it different? In the beginning, in the 18th and 19th century, we were a very highly unequal society because based on marginalizing gender and caste. But the architect of India's constitution, Dr. Ambedkar, did a wonderful job and gave special attention to disadvantaged sections of Indian society, women who were regularly discarded, social caste, social scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and OBCs. Special provisions were made for them, as well as affirmative action, which was the first in India. But despite all of this, India is ranked towards the bottom of the gender gap report. The 2023 says that it is 127 out of 146 countries. Discrimination on the basis of caste was banned by law in the Constitution and further enshrined not only in the Constitution but also as other kinds of legislation. However, the Economist, to quote the Economist, the India's caste system remains entrenched after 76 years of independence, still facing caste-based problems, discrimination in rural areas, and in small villages, untouchability is still a practice. Scheduled caste are right across India, and 16.6% in the 2011 census, and in 2021 we did not have a census because of COVID. However, the Economist estimates that 232 million of India's 1.4 billion population today belongs to the scheduled castes. The hierarchy of castes excluded many groups from education. The concept of inclusive education welcomes all children irrespective of social category in terms of caste in India. Then, of course, what is common to everybody else is class, gender, religion, language, sexual orientation, physical or mental challenges. The Right to Education Act in India, that all private schools will have 25% free seats for weaker sections of the population. But what that happens is that simply inserting them doesn't mean accepting them. And simply increasing enrollment of disadvantaged students, but excluding them socially in and out of school, does much damage to their psyches. And then, if that is the case, they face hostilities from peers as well as teachers, as well as professors and teachers. Reports of students committing suicide because of the constant bullying and harassment by other students or even by professors. Now, the underpinnings of exclusion are diversity, and I'm not going to go through this because I'm out of time. And there's diversity in schools. Diversity in teacher education is very important because the teachers lack knowledge about different cultures. They definitely are not prepared for handling physically and mentally different students. And the need for a variety of teaching strategies to suit different teaching styles is most important, but they don't get that in their teacher education. It's not only a moral issue of social justice, it is also has economic implications. And the third thing about the underpinning of inclusion is difference. Difference is based on differences among people, and it's a comparative term. It's not a deficiency, it's not a disability. It's socially constructed, and that's the thing. That we construct the difference on something that we see. We construct whether it's good or bad. I don't want to go into this, but difference is intrinsic to humans. Teachers have to understand difference, the other, equality. Difference is intrinsic to human beings because human beings are inherently diverse. We are told by the Human Rights Declaration that we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights, but we know so I'm really out of time, and I wish I could have talked a little more, but inequality in society leads to a lot of problems. Exclusion leads to inequality, and when we are excluded, we are really not contributing to society. Teacher education is extremely important, and the development of inclusive education is it a Western concept? The term originated in the West, but it's not new to people in the global South. There were many belief systems in indigenous, in China, in Africa, Ubuntu, in Latin America, in India. Rabindranath Tagore is one of the earliest to show a unique sensitivity to gender differences. There are differences in the North and the South, and there are many international documents on inclusion as well as on inclusive education. And we have national documents in India which protect the rights of marginalized people. But in conclusion, I will say that despite all this legislation, still many children are out of school globally. Complexities involved there are many complexities in inclusive education because a change in worldview, and in addition to that, considerable financial and human resources. The interpretation is context dependent and to a great extent dependent on economic resources of a country and the social norms of that country. There cannot be a single interpretation of inclusive education. The principle behind inclusive education is to be aspired to. The dignity and right of every human being demands equal opportunity for each. But inclusion can be seen in a continuum. The societies around the globe will achieve it at different times at different levels. We will gradually go towards it. The inclusion is a paradigmatic shift. It's a paradigm shift in education. It's a paradigm shift in society. Shift in social attitudes. Teachers are the medium for promoting that. Their challenge is to examine their own values, their biases. We cannot achieve the goals of SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is inclusion, without drastic changes in how we live and organize ourselves on this planet. Thank you.